Hello, everyone. My name is Joshua Gilliland, attorney blogger on Bowtie Law, and with Jessica Meterson on the Legal Geeks. Today with me are my friends from Planet Data to discuss the duty of competency and effective project management. Because as we all know, in electronic discovery, you need to have effective project management to be competent. And let's talk about that and explore some cases where this has been a very huge issue. So first to introduce themselves, why don't we have David Cochran. David, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Josh. How are you?
Excellent, thank you. So could you introduce yourself for all of our listeners and tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. Well, I'm Dave Cochran. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Planet Data, and I've been doing litigation support discovery management since 1985. I got into the business back in the old paper days, where I think there's still a lot of comparable process and procedure that goes on today. And my background is project management, operations, consulting, and I've managed some divisions of other lit support businesses.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to have you here. Also with us is the CEO of Planet Data, Howard Reissner. Howard, how are you today?
Oh, great, Josh. Thanks.
It's good to be with you again, and I look forward to discussing competency, which you and I have kicked around before, and putting the spin on project management.
Yeah. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, no problem. So, David, could you help define project management for all of our listeners?
Sure. You know, project management has a lot of definitions, but I think it's a very basic one. It's an individual who has very good planning skills, has very good organizational skills, understands process, workflow. But to me, the most important aspect of a good project manager is communication. And then applying all of that into the legal dynamic is, making sure that a project manager not only communicates with if we're talking about inside of a law firm or a corporate legal department, coordinating with their client internally, their business unit, but also with outside counsel as well as a supplier, and managing all those aspects of a project going forward. And it takes a very unique individual to be able to do that. And project management today, I think, is one of the more important skill sets, important positions that are required out in the industry as we see it today.
Agreed, and I think there are two cases in the past 3 years that truly highlight effective project management. And the first is INRI Delta, which dealt with baggage handling fees, and the TD Bank case out of Florida. And just the quick overview of those cases, Delta involved communications between the associate handling the case to the service provider, and there were some miscommunications, and 2 hard drives weren't searched, and they were sitting in the service provider's evidence locker for X number of months, if not 2 years, and they caught the mistake. Despite trying to do everything to correct the mistake, they ended up still getting sanctioned for fees and costs in a 45-page opinion in which the judge described their workflow as a huge hole in their e-discovery process. The TD Bank case had some really hurtful quotes from the judge in it, in which the judge referred to the law firm handling the case as having too many cooks in the kitchen, and also operating in an Inspector Clouseau type fashion, where there was the first law firm and a service provider, and a second law firm came into the situation, and a lot of miscommunications, and there was a very bad production that took place in which things that should have been produced natively or at a minimum as colored TIFFs were produced as, I believe, paper that was printed and then rescanned. So there was bad things that followed. Howard, you and I both read lots of cases. What are your thoughts on some of the issues that were presented in Delta and TD Bank?
Well, I think they're 2 different cases and they're 2 different sets of issues. But just addressing each one quickly, I think the Delta case is a real example of how important it is to have strong project management and workflow. it was, the sanctions took place because, well down into the case, it was discovered when they started to get into depositions that some of this data was never collected and was not properly identified by counsel. And they were sanctioned under FRCP 26G, and the attorney, of course, had certified to the best of their knowledge that the discovery response was correct and accurate. You and I have had previous discussions about not only does that get into a sanctioning scenario, but potentially in the future this could actually be an ethical violation because we've discussed about the ABA model rules, which have been adopted in many states about the lawyer's duty of competency, and this could reflect upon that. The TD case is more problematic even than you suggested, because not only the documents that were not produced correctly in native format were actually really hot documents that pointed out some of the real key issue about that this was potentially a very high-risk investment that showed up in the original color document, but not in the printed black and white. And what this did, in addition to creating sanctions against the law firm and the defendant corporation, the judge really came down on them and essentially ruled on a collateral estoppel issue, that on that particular issue, they could no longer rely on that in future litigation. So it's not just the sanctions in this particular case, but it's going to have likely severe economic repercussions because they will not be able to, that's basically a collateral estoppel cannot challenge that issue in what potentially could be numerous other litigations contesting the same issue.
Yeah, they are train wrecks of what not to do and quite disturbing to read. And they are excellent life lessons because TD Bank could have happened to any law firm, any of the big ones. And I've heard a lot of lawyers say that it could have happened to anyone, and it was a great firm that was involved in it. Well, let's focus on the positive and what we can learn from cases like this. And David, what are your thoughts on what goes into effective project management?
Well, I think, reading both of these cases, I come away with the fact that there was not one focal point person in charge from a discovery management, project management role. And without that person in charge, I'm not talking about the lawyer practicing, and talking about legal issues, but coordinating all of the logistics and all the document management, there was no roadmap in place, no accountability. The accountability was spread, but nobody was coordinating those particular logistical opportunities, such as the data sitting inside the locker, and who knew what when. And I don't think there, in addition to the roadmap not being implemented, there was no, what I like to call, scope of work, business plan for a project that should be put into place that assigns responsibility and then tracks the accountability and the progress of a case. And so that, when your legal team gets to court, gets to trial, there's that confidence that everything was done properly, there was competency completed, and that there is a chain of custody, and there is a, the roadmap with respect to being able to track back to where particular media was located, how the data was processed, all the tracking of production, status reports, et cetera, all done by one individual. And I think that was lacking in both of these instances.
Howard, what are your thoughts on what goes into somebody being an effective project manager?
I think I absolutely agree with Dave that you have to have a process, and you have to have somebody who's ultimately in charge. No longer, as we again discussed, can an attorney just delegate this down and say, I delegated it down, whether it's a service provider or it's just a subordinate. They are responsible for tracking this, and I think it's a competent, repeatable methodology which is followed at all times and followed up with, and again, somebody, as Dave said, who ultimately is responsible for this each and every time.
So let's talk about some of the best practices that would go into effective project management. And David, you started hitting on those with the repeatable process, the chain of custody, one point of contact. But what else would you put into the system, such as maybe a decision tracking tool, whether it's a case wiki or something along those lines where you can actually see all the decision points.
Absolutely. And I think it starts with what I call a scope of work or a statement of services that talks about what's going to happen on a project, define the specifications for a project from collections to processing to hosting, what's going to happen on that project, who's going to be accountable for that. Also talking about any budget related issues, because at the end of the day, your client's going to want to know how much a project is going to cost, not only for legal fees, but processing outside. So now you have that foundational document, and you can begin to, and you can put that inside of a wiki or a tracking mechanism or a dashboard, frankly, which I think is one of the better tools to utilize for that, so that everyone can see what's going on a project at each phase of that particular project. And then you're able to monitor the success or the challenge areas for the particular project, and then repeat back or work with the PM or work with the respective group where things may be behind, whether it's an outside supplier or you're doing review and they're behind. You're able to track progress, so that at the end of the day, you know where your goal is going forward. Because at times there's so much focused on technology, and I think what's taken for granted or not, there's not enough focus on, is that project manager. People believe that technology will solve all the issues, and that's not always the case. So, having these processes and procedures, doing some really great planning, and understanding the sort of legal environment within that project manager, they are an effective member of that legal team. And I think that's one of the big areas, it's one of my soapbox areas, that those individuals have not been recognized as important in the past. It's always been the partner, the associates, and the legal assistants, but a good legal project manager is a tough individual to find, but if you've got one, they are going to be the most important component of your project team.
And I agree with everything that you said, but I would also add one of the biggest tripping points in project management is when there isn't a decision tool that's being used, whether it's the wiki or the dashboard or whatever, and they're just trying to track everything in Outlook. Well, that means decision points are in somebody's email inbox. Right. And the people who were involved on the email string might know. But when you look at the life cycle of a case and employee turnover, whether it's a service provider or at a law firm, that could be a bad thing because decisions can get lost. And people who are involved in, say, processing or the initial part of the case when ECA is also being done, like the early stages, might not be the same people in the later stages who need to explain to a judge what decisions were made by people earlier in the food chain. And that's lost when it's just existing in somebody's email inbox. Howard, do you have any insight that you would like to add about best practices for project management?
I think I just would follow up with what David just said. I think that where we've run into circumstances where we hear people talk about situations that didn't go well for them. I mean, the major complaint is either there was nobody focused on running this, or they were not responsive. There was a lack of communication. They didn't return my email or my phone call in a timely manner. We think those are real differentiators, and as Dave said, it's just not plug it into the software and you're there. And we think it's a key component of being a really strong partner with our clients.
I think, Josh, too, going back to your question before, it goes back to, starting as I did back in the 80s in the paper, we used to have these things called decisions log, which were back before PCs, and so you tracked it. Today, being able to have collaborative tools within the processing platform, within the ECA platform, to be able to do what I call search analysis reporting, that allows you to be able to know how you search for a particular report or custodian, et cetera, that gives you that documentation and the ability to go back to a judge and say, here's what we did, Your Honor, in this particular case, not only from collections to processing to ECA to hosting and production. Having all that in a system, in an approach for management is very important.
Yeah, I think you both have hit the nail on the head with this, which now raises this issue of this is a new practice area for attorneys and law firms. And you grew up in this field. And what are your thoughts on someone who wants to get into it and how they should educate themselves to become a project manager?
That's a great question. I think that as we recruit, and I know that as law firms recruit for legal project managers, the skill set is, as I've talked about before, good planning, good communication, good organizational skills, but they also need to understand the legal environment. They also have to have that technology bent. So they're able to use the technology to help them with their communication, help them guide and consult the attorneys. Because truly, that's the way I think of project managers, is that they are consultants to their legal teams. And even as a consultant within a provider, they're consulting and adding value to a law firm client or a corporate client who may not have that experience. So, a consulting background, 10 years experience, 7 to 10 years experience is very important, because it gives you the opportunity to have lived many of these experiences that clients are realizing today. You can't come out of college and be a project manager. It's not you can, but you're not going to add a lot of value to your client going forward.
Well, that raises some interesting issues on what kind of law firms or corporations have people in-house that do the work versus those who outsource it. And Howard, could I get your thoughts on who brings a project manager in-house and what type of organization outsources that job requirement?
I think that's an individual decision that goes, and I think Dave can speak to this as well, to the larger macro issue of how they're going to organize their data and how they're going to manage and how they're going to run their discovery practice. I mean, there are definitely organizations that have decided they're going to try to internalize more of this. And if you do that, then you better have strong outward-facing project managers that can run this. And if you're going to outsource it, then at the very minimum, you should have people internally that interface well with your external providers. And I think it's a case-by-case decision, and there are probably numerous arguments pro and con.
David, your thoughts?
Yeah, I've seen our clients that are under 50 lawyers that had dedicated litigation support, discovery management sort staff, to very large 200 plus with 1 or 2 people doing that, and really focusing on utilizing their trusted suppliers in providing those services. So it's a sort of across the board, and I feel the same way in the corporations too.
Yeah, I agree. I've seen all shapes of this, from the mega firms. Most of the mega firms have people or a team assigned to do this. Small to mid-size, some bring it in, some outsource it. Generally the solos, I mean the 2-3 lawyer shops are outsourcing it and having their trusted service provider help them out. So let's end this where we began in thinking about the duty of competency. And Howard, in closing, why do you think effective project management is vital for lawyers to be competent in their representation?
Well, if we go back and revisit that, the thought about 26G and the ABA rules about professional competency, then certainly this now compels lawyers, both from the federal rules and from the ethical requirements, to have a competency in this. And again, even if you're going to delegate, you can't delegate if you don't know what the underlying issues are and the facts, be able to follow up, know the issues, ask the right questions of the people that you're delegating this to. And clearly in any complex litigation or matter, there are going to be multiple people involved. You better know how to organize it, and again, make sure that you are fulfilling the professional requirements. And I think that courts are becoming more demanding of that level of competency, and as we see from the cases that we cited earlier on, they're less willing to give counsel who don't fulfill these requirements a pass anymore.
And it's not just 26G, but also Rule 11. And so there aren't a ton of Rule 11 cases, because normally discovery starts getting produced, and that's when the train comes off the tracks. But even Rule 11 at the beginning of the case, where generally speaking it'd be a plaintiff preparing the case and doing the initial inquiry, and whether or not that inquiry is reasonable. If you're looking through a large data set, that could have a Rule 11 tie-in as well if you are not doing your due diligence there. So it's there are several big touch points where courts have some serious teeth to go after a lawyer that's not doing their job effectively when it comes to project management. So with that said, I appreciate Howard and David sharing their insight. If you want to learn more about Planet Data, check out their website. And Howard, what's the URL?
It's www.planetdata.com.
So everyone, check them out. They are friends. I do enjoy meeting with them and having activities with them. So be sure to check them out. And everyone, thank you all for joining us today, and tune in next time.